And we're back, and we're going to start with section number 4. Where does culture come from? Humans create culture. As far as we can tell, this isn't true with any other creatures. Lots of animals communicate. They have social organization. Some have advanced language. Prairie dogs, for instance, use different kinds of chirps to describe various predators such as hawks or coyotes. This language is so advanced, says Konslobodkov. Yeah, I totally crucified that one. Who has studied prairie dog language for 30 years, that in 1/10 of a second, prairie dogs can use vocal calls to say something as specific as tall, thin human wearing blue shirt walking slowly across the colony. For humans, though, speech is the most significant way we communicate. As Walter Ong said, man communicates with his whole body, and yet the word is his primary medium. Communication, like knowledge, flowers in speech. Other creatures communicate through vocalizations, posture, and even blushing. Humans do this too, but only human beings use the spoken word to permanently alter their surroundings for their own benefit. The spoken word creates culture. The use of spoken language is universal among human communities. One of the early cultural anthropologists focusing on spoken language, Edward Sapir, wrote in 1921, "There is no more striking general fact about language than its universality. One may argue as to whether a particular tribe engages in activities that are worthy of the name of religion or of art, but we know of no people that is not possessed of a fully developed language. The lowliest South African bushman speaks in the forms of a rich symbolic system that is in essence perfectly comparable to the speech of the cultivated Frenchman." Human beings use spoken language to link themselves to the surrounding environment, to regulate their behavior in community, and even to develop higher mental processes. Human use of spoken language is different from other animals, not only on the level of what our mouth and tongue structure make possible, but also on the level of the purpose to which it is put. Animal communication can be quite advanced, but it always seems to be on the level of signs. A sign is a stimulus, a unit of sensory input that rouses the organism to action. This sign announces that which it is a part of. Thunder, for example, is a sign of an advancing storm. Spoken language does make use of signs, of course, but it primarily revolves around symbols. A symbol is a stimulus as well, but the relationship with the thing to which it refers is not as clear as the relationship between thunder and a storm. Rather, it is based on the agreement of human users. For example, a nation's flag symbolizes not only what its government does, but all that its culture represents to those who participate in it. When as few as 2 of us begin to use spoken language to communicate, we develop ways of understanding the world that make sense to us, that organize our perceptions of the world, and that allow us to change our environment based on the agreements we've made. Over time, even the natural things in our environment become symbols to us. Mountains symbolize majesty. A burbling brook symbolizes peace. An elk with a full set of antlers symbolizes strength. These things may have little symbolic meaning in and of themselves, but when we conceive of them in a certain way, it changes the way we think and communicate. Mountains don't just change what we think of as majestic. Our developing sense of majesty changes how we see mountains. For several decades, Ken Myers has read widely and thought deeply about cultural change. Starting out as a reporter and producer for public radio, Myers developed a highly regarded audio magazine called the Mars Hill Audio Journal, in which he interviews authors and thinkers who discuss everything from science to literature to theology, all in the service of coaxing Christians below life's surface into the fascinating and dramatic world of ideas. The Mars Hill Audio Journal has become a cultural phenomenon in and of itself. Its subscribers might number only in the thousands, as opposed to the millions who view television, read magazines, or pick up newspapers, but those thousands are some of the most influential Christian thought leaders in the world. Mars Hill Audio Journal subscribers trust Myers' insights about culture. These insights are possible, Myers says, because he pays attention to 6 aspects of culture: rather than just the one or two most other people consider. And you would ask, what are those 6 aspects? And we're going to talk about them. The first one is artifacts. An artifact is an object made by a human being. Artifacts include material things such as cars and buildings, but also less tangible yet very real things such as literary forms and styles of design. Artifacts may seem like mere things, but as we interact with them, our habits change. Digital technology, for example, is an artifact common all over the world. It has changed the way we communicate. Social media, websites, email, and texting have also changed the nature of manners. It is now considered normal, for example, to look at our phones when we receive a text message, even if doing so interrupts an important conversation. Text messaging has literally changed the conventions of how we converse with one another. But other artifacts have had an even more enduring impact. In Chapter 1, we talked about Gutenberg's invention of a printing press with movable type. Who could have predicted how much this would change the world? Certainly not the kings and queens and religious leaders whose authority was eventually challenged by the books Gutenberg and others printed. More people learned to read. More books became available. Previously squelched thoughts spread like wildfire. The official version of events was challenged, and no one could stop it. On the surface, life in literate households seemed to change very little. Below the surface, though, everything had changed. A house where the works of Martin Luther were read may have looked like all the other houses in the neighborhood, but what its occupants read changed what they believed, how they spent their time, whom they associated with, and what they talked about. They regarded the Catholic Church no longer as the repository of all truth, but in fact as an institution that must be opposed. In a very real way, the artifact of the printing press made the Reformation possible. Number 2, institutions. The sorts of institutions we develop as human communities end up organizing their own sorts of behaviors. Okay, I'm going to try that one more time. The sorts of institutions we develop as human communities end up organizing their own sorts of behavior. I'm still not reading it right. Anyway. Bleh. Consider the New York Times, a newspaper with a daily circulation of around 1 million readers. That's a lot of subscribers, but compared to all of the other newspapers available and the billions of people living on the planet, it isn't really that vast. And yet the New York Times is considered to be the newspaper of record in the industry. It has become an institution. If an event isn't reported in the Times, the decision makers in politics, culture, and business don't view it as relevant. Hundreds of millions of people pay attention to the decision makers of the world who read this particular newspaper. This is the true influence of the Times. Over the years, certain institutions develop symbolic significance that makes the actions of those institutions seem more important. The category of institutions also includes churches and the various doctrines and movements that go along with them, schools, including the associated knowledge, their history, and their sports traditions, sports leagues, governmental agencies, country clubs, social organizations, and neighborhood associations that we join, cheer for, and support, and that set the rules and establish expectations. In America, the National Football League, or NFL, is an important institution governing culture. During football season, millions of people schedule their week around the games featuring their favored teams. Advertisers make it possible to broadcast the games at no charge and in turn use the time allotted to shape the tastes, perceptions, and buying habits of the audience. At a deeper level, people use analogies from football to structure the way they think about everything else, including the way they do business. In America, throwing a Hail Mary pass becomes a way to describe taking a great risk in the hopes of gaining a potentially large reward. In cultures without exposure to American football or without any sense of what the Ave Maria, which is the Hail Mary prayer, is in the Catholic Church, such an analogy makes no sense at all. The institutions we embrace determine what kinds of people we accept as heroes, what sort of trash talk we tolerate, what kinds of products we view as cool, how we understand competition, how we relate to coworkers, friends, and family, what sorts of clothing we buy, what constitutes masculinity or femininity, what kinds of foods we eat, what we see as the rules of combat, and so much more. If we take this and multiply it by the hundreds of thousands of institutions in America alone, we can see that the institutions of society have a far-reaching effect on how we understand culture. The third one is practices. The third aspect of culture Myers emphasizes is common practices, such as celebrating holidays, attending weddings, funerals, and awards shows, going on vacations, and voting in elections. I once traveled to a predominantly Catholic country during the observance of All Saints' Day. Coming from a nation with a lot of Catholics, but where Catholicism is far from dominant, I was stunned to see the entire nation's system of commerce shut down. Restaurants, offices, taxis, everything. The only people working, with few exception, were the non-Catholics. Christmas Day is similar in the United States. Every culture has traditional observances that express what is important to people. For example, what we think is proper in forming family relationships shows up in how we conduct weddings. Funerals display how we view death. High school dances and socials shape how we view courting rituals and the transition from adolescence into adulthood. Birthday parties reinforce the emphasis we put on individuals as opposed to the community. We might not even think twice about the practices we engage in, but they too affect culture at a deep level. 4. Beliefs. The deeply held beliefs of a group of people about things like the value of human life, heaven and hell, what makes a person a hero, how family members should relate to one another, how we should behave at school or work or church, and what makes something right or wrong affects how a culture develops. Some friends of mine were on a flight with a group of teachers visiting from another country who were experiencing their first trip to the United States. The flight attendant announced that several members of the military were on board and asked the passengers to thank them for their service. Everyone clapped heartily. The non-Americans looked quizzically at my friends. "Why are they doing this?" they asked. "Because members of the military are heroes," my friends replied. Their guests found this stunning. In their country, members of the military are often brutal individuals who coerce others and force them to pay bribes. The flight attendant might as well have said, "We have a lot of mean bullies on the flight today. Let's show them our appreciation." It took quite a while for these guests to regain a positive view of America. This in turn must have been baffling for their American hosts, who clearly appreciated the sacrifice members of the military make. Beliefs usually come to the surface only when we interact with people who have different ones, yet they deeply affect our culture. 5. Moods, styles, ethos. To use another American example, there are big differences between the cosmopolitan, fast-paced style of living in large cities such as New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, and the more measured pace of Middle America. Those living in the western part of the country are thought to value rugged individualism, while city dwellers tend to accept limits to their freedom as the price of the good life. We often talk of red state versus blue state, with red states tending to elect a higher percentage of conservative politicians, and blue states tending to elect a higher percentage of liberal ones. But even these differences tend to be urban versus rural. Regional differences such as Texas swagger, Yankee ingenuity, Hawaii surfer attitude, Kansas common sense, and North Carolina gentility are all examples of cultural moods. Ethos is a Greek word referring to what we think of as good, certain moods and styles that form our cultural distinctives. Ethos is hard to pin down, but it's real. A bumper sticker that says, "American by birth, Southern by the grace of God," will elicit a smile and nod in Alabama, but probably a smirk or frown in Rhode Island. Even the code of honor differs from northern to southern states. In one study, male students were instructed to fill out a questionnaire. They also provided saliva samples and were told that their blood sugar levels would be monitored throughout the experiment. In reality, researchers plan to monitor the students' cortisol and testosterone levels before and after the experiment to gauge their reactions. After the students completed their questionnaires, they walked down a hallway to turn them in, but one of the researchers deliberately bumped into them on the way and uttered a rude remark. Following the incident, the participants provided another saliva sample. Young men from a southern culture were significantly more likely to have elevated cortisol and testosterone levels, indicating that they viewed the rude remark as an insult to their honor and were instinctively preparing to fight. Young men from a northern culture, on the other hand, dismissed the insult as an indication that the other person was a jerk and little more. How did this significant difference in response to an insult come about? Through parental training? School? It's hard to say. Likely these young men picked up a sense of how they should respond to acts of aggression from the attitudes, remarks, and habits of those around them. They didn't even realize they were doing it. Moods, styles, and ethos are deeply embedded aspects of culture. 6. Meta-beliefs. Meyer's sixth aspect of culture refers to the intuitive sense or gut instinct of what life is about. Meta-beliefs display a posture toward creation. For instance, people's sense of why we're here and how we ought to act toward other people and creation forms a highly significant aspect of culture. Once, on a wild van ride through the streets of Manila in the Philippines, I noticed that drivers didn't seem to mind if another vehicle cut directly in front of them. In America, I observed, that would have gotten a very angry response and perhaps a certain hand gesture. My driver shrugged and replied that in the Philippines, a crowded country, you have a right to the space you occupy and nothing more. Americans, on the other hand, tend to believe they have a right to where they currently are as well as where they are going. If you step in their way or cut in line or move in front of them in traffic, they'll be angry. This sense of a right is a meta-belief, a belief about which beliefs are worth having and how we ought to act in certain situations. People can live their entire lives without considering what their meta-beliefs are or how they were formed, but such beliefs affect their actions every day. These 6 aspects of culture sensitize us to how cultures actually operate. That's important. As cultural anthropologists, we need to understand the way subtle experiences affect the way we live and interact with others. These 6 aspects reveal why Miley Cyrus's and Queen Latifah's performances were so powerful as culture shapers. They were artifacts in programs that have become institutions in and of themselves. These performances spread rapidly through both traditional and non-traditional media, introducing new practices that celebrated beliefs supported by a cultural mood of wanting to be edgy and cool and proposing a new meta-belief for followers of pop culture to consider. Tastefulness is everything. Cyrus's performance was tasteless and therefore bad. Latifah's was tastefully done and therefore good, regardless of the values either artist promoted. Some will take issue with this particular example, but we can all agree that culture-shaping events are taking place around us every day. We would probably also admit that we rarely contemplate their effects. Think about what we're encouraged to pay attention to when we watch television or go to the movies. When future generations judge whether it was worthwhile for our civilization to have existed, is this the evidence we want them to consider? Obviously, there are things in every society to be proud of, but if we look at it objectively, there is much to be ashamed of as well. The measure of a trivial culture is not only that its people don't care, but also that they don't care that they don't care. It takes a great deal of discernment to evaluate what is happening in the culture and how it ought to be viewed from a Christian worldview. Christians are always wondering how to respond to the culture around them. Should they condemn it? Should they admonish those who produce it? Should they perhaps just ignore it? As it turns out, these are questions Christians have been wrestling with for more than 2,000 years. Section 5. What should Christians do about culture? In 1949, a theologian named H. Richard Niebuhr delivered a series of lectures on Christian cultural engagement for the Alumni Foundation at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. In 1951, Niebuhr turned his lectures into an influential book called Christ and Culture. Some people like the book, others don't. Those who like it think it helpfully describes how Christians have engaged with culture through the centuries. Those who dislike it say Niebuhr's framework is too simplistic. But if we don't go too far with it, Niebuhr's description of 5 Christian approaches to culture can help us see where Christians have agreed and disagreed about culture in the past, and how we might be able to transform culture even though we may be in exile, as the Jews were when the prophet Jeremiah instructed them to settle in and become a blessing to their captors. With these caveats in mind, let's take a look at Niebuhr's description of 5 distinct approaches to culture that Christians have taken throughout the centuries. The first one is Christ against culture. The first approach Niebuhr discussed is based on 1 John 2:15 through 17, which instructs Christians not to love the world, emphasizing that the love of the Father is not in those who love the world, and that the world will pass away. Those who hold the Christ against culture view, according to Niebuhr, believe the world is the region of darkness into which the citizens of the kingdom of light must not enter. It is characterized by the prevalence in it of lies, hatred, and murder. It is a culture that is concerned with temporal and passing values, whereas Christ has words of eternal life. Historically, the Christ against culture approach originated with the church father Tertullian, for whom, according to Niebuhr, avoidance of sin and fearsome preparation for the coming day of judgment seemed more important than thankful acceptance of God's grace in the gift of his Son. Today, the Christ against culture view is common among groups with a Mennonite, Amish, or Quaker tradition. As with most of other Christian approaches to culture, the Christ against culture view is an important restraint against the worship of the state and worldly power. People holding this view have played an important role in opposing corrupt institutions such as chattel slavery and forming new institutions that have challenged the authority of the old ones. And yet these groups didn't achieve cultural reform on their own. They formed the first line of resistance, Niebuhr pointed out, but others who didn't hesitate to get involved were the ones who brought about the actual change. After all, people who have withdrawn from culture have a hard time understanding their neighbors, and it's hard to love a neighbor you don't understand. A modern version of Christ against culture, the Benedict option, is gaining traction among Christians discouraged with the direction of culture. In the AD 400s, St. Benedict's parents sent him to Rome to complete his education. Shocked by the city's decadence, Benedict fled into the wilderness to form an alternative community. Ultimately, Rome collapsed, but these Benedictine communities survived and preserved culture. Journalist Rod Dreher says, Rome's collapse meant staggering loss. People forgot how to read, how to farm, how to govern themselves, how to build houses, how to trade, and even what it had once meant to be a human being. Behind monastery walls, though, in their chapels, scriptoriums, and refectories, Benedict's monks built lives of peace, order, and learning, and spread their network throughout Western Europe. According to Dreher, the Benedictine monasteries were the bases from which European civilization once again emerged. He points to similar communities today, such as Clear Creek Abbey in Oklahoma, a center for Benedictine thought centered around a monastery, in Eagle River, Alaska, an Orthodox community formed around a church. Other examples included the Simple Way community in Philadelphia and the Homestead Heritage community near Waco, Texas. Christ of culture. The Christ of culture view tends to hail Jesus as the Messiah of a particular culture. People who see America as God's chosen people, a new Israel, for example, would fit this view. So would others in history like John Locke, Immanuel Kant, and Thomas Jefferson, who tried to show that the life of reason forms a uniquely good culture on which Jesus would certainly put his stamp of approval. In the 20th century, President Woodrow Wilson represented a progressive view of the Christ of culture perspective in promoting America as a nation that, because of its enlightened and advanced state, ought to serve the world by helping other nations become like it was. Said Wilson, "It is the American duty to stand shoulder to shoulder, to lift the burdens of mankind in the future and show the paths of freedom to all the world." Richard Niebuhr stated that the church father who most aligned with this view was Peter Abelard, a scholar who thought that the tension between the church and the world was really due to the church's misunderstanding of Christ as somehow opposed to the life of reason. Many societies have formed around the thought that their unique cultural expression was an especially Christian one. Such groups as the Dutch Reformed and the Scottish Presbyterians commingled their ethnic identity with their religious one. The truly good person, it was thought, would represent both. Others who embrace the Christ of culture view, though, aren't as concerned about a specific cultural tradition as they are about removing Christianity's rough edges and seemingly harsher claims. They want people to think of Christians as those who represent the uplifting morality and love of Jesus, not those who embrace biblical claims or commands. Christianity embodies that which is nice and reasonable, they believe. Let's not get too much into the details. On the good side, the Christ of culture view is usually focused on maintaining a good culture and is well-meaning in its desire to identify Jesus with what people in a society believe to be their finest ideals, their noblest institutions, and their best philosophy. There is a downside, however. Many bad things have been done based on the assumption that our culture is uniquely blessed of God and therefore should be spread abroad. Examples in history are numerous, such as the belief among European nations that they were exercising kindness by taking over developing nations and imposing their values on them, often with uncalled for harshness. In nations like South Africa, this resulted in the policy of apartheid, which officially diminished the value of non-whites and led to a racially oppressive society. Christ above culture. The Christ above culture view proposes that, as Richard Niebuhr phrased it, the fundamental issue does not lie between Christ and the world, important as that issue is, but between God and man. In a world of sin, what does God require? He requires that believers obey him in all their actions, relationships, and work. The focus is on one's personal relationship with God. The culture is chock full of sin, and the goal is not to change it, but to point people to God. Historically, the church father whom Niebuhr identified most closely with the Christ above culture view was Clement of Alexandria, who set forth the view in his book The Instructor, that the goal of Christianity was primarily to improve the souls of people so that they could live more virtuous lives. Personally, I encountered this view while attending graduate school at a traditionally Baptist university. Not being too familiar with Baptist theology, I found my professors' personal self-control and temperance admirable, but their lack of interest in applying the Bible to their courses was perplexing. To them, mixing Christianity and scholarship would pollute Christianity. The two didn't mix. While Baptist beliefs vary widely, the Baptist view to which I was exposed thought it untoward to bring Christ into the educational process, except when it came to encouraging students to live personally pious lives. On the good side, the Christ above culture view keeps one's focus on the many paradoxes of Christianity in the world, such as believers being in the world but not of the world, God being both immanent and transcendent, and Christians living in the temporal world while realizing that it's not our eternal home. In the same way as two halves of a pitched roof lean on each other and through tension create strength, the Christ above culture view enables Christians to cooperate with non-believers in making a good society while not losing their faith's distinctiveness. The downside is significant, though. What happens if relying on non-believers to make a good society actually results in a society that is against Christ? This happens in history more often than we might like to admit. For example, Erwin W. Lutzer tells the story of how Christians became complicit in Nazi Germany's rise. After World War I, Germany was beset by runaway inflation, crime, and decadence. The Nazis brought the currency back under control, instituted nationalized health care, established training schools, controlled crime, and embarked on ambitious public works programs. Supportive of making Germany stronger, many Christians failed to heed the warnings that Adolf Hitler was a bad man with bad intentions for the nation. The pastor, Martin Niemöller, once attended a meeting in which Hitler said, "You confine yourself to the church. I'll take care of the German people." Niemöller, at the end of the conversation, said to Hitler, "You said that I will take care of the German people, but we too, as Christians and churchmen, have a responsibility toward the German people. That responsibility was entrusted to us by God, and neither you nor anyone in the world has the power to take it from us." That evening, Gestapo thugs ransacked Niemöller's rectory, and a few days later, a bomb exploded in his church. Niemöller was ultimately imprisoned, accused of using his pulpit to speak with malicious and provocative criticism of a kind calculated to undermine the confidence of the people in their political leaders. Looking back, we can easily see that a synthesis between Nazism and Christianity was impossible. One would win and the other lose, but why wasn't this more obvious at the time? Going along with laws specifying building codes and traffic patterns might be perfectly reasonable, but can we really have a firm basis for such commands as helping the poor and refraining from stealing, even when it costs us greatly, apart from God's eternal law? Number 4, Christ and culture in paradox. As Christians, our place in the world does seem odd. As Andy Crouch puts it, we're both immigrants and missionaries at the same time. The Christ and culture in paradox view focuses on trying to reconcile the tension between Christ having made all things new and yet things in the world being as they have been since the fall. Our righteousness is as filthy rags, Scripture says, and yet we're called to deeds of righteousness. God has revealed himself in Christ, and yet we see as though through a glass darkly. Essentially, the Christ and culture in paradox view says that culture must be important. Otherwise, why would God leave us here? But it is also broken and cannot be fixed apart from the power of Christ redeeming the people who make up the culture. Niebuhr identified the Christ and culture in paradox view with the church father Marcion. Let's go with Marcion. For whom the world was stupid and bad, crawling with vermin, a miserable hole, an object of scorn. Humans may have achieved great things, but compared to who God is, our work is pretty meaningless. We might be proud of the majestic buildings in our town's business district, but from outer space, they don't appear very different from the neighboring shanties. As you can imagine, one of the main goals of the Christ and culture in paradox view is to find those who are influential in the culture and witness to them, in the hope that their culture-shaping power might be used to promote Christ. Star athletes, musicians, and business leaders who come to faith in Christ are trumpeted, and young people are encouraged to attain positions of influence so they can have a stronger platform from which to proclaim the gospel. Many different Christian traditions have tried to resolve this paradox. Most conclude that culture cannot draw us closer to God, but God can enable us to live wisely and do faithfully and lovingly what culture teaches or requires us to do. On the good side, the Christ and culture in paradox view speaks openly of the struggle of being isolated from the culture because of the strangeness of our beliefs, and it highlights how good the good news is in saving us from corruption. People who embrace the paradox have made substantial contributions in history, such as separating the branches of government and making them accountable to one another to hold back the power of sin. Still, the Christ and culture in paradox view can lead to a sort of hopelessness in relation to culture. If heaven is our goal, and the best thing that can happen to us is that we'll die and be united with God, then what is the point in investing intentionally in our culture here on earth? What we do here may help our personal spiritual development, the thinking goes, but shaping culture is a sort of waste of time. And number 5, Christ, the transformer of culture. The finished work of Christ is available to us here and now in bringing the newness of redemption to every aspect of culture. That's the hope that Christ, the transformer of culture view, expresses. Beginning with a strong view of creation, which was to Niebuhr a kind of prologue to the one mighty deed of atonement. It acknowledges that humanity's fall into sin has corrupted, warped, twisted, and misdirected us, and yet it also calls us to restore culture to what is good rather than replacing it with something different. Niebuhr called people who hold hold this view conversionists. For the conversionist, history is the story of God's mighty deeds and of man's responses to them. He lives somewhat less between the times and somewhat more in the divine now than do his brother Christians. An early Christian tract from ancient Rome called the Letter to Diognetus described it this way: what the soul is in the body, that are Christians in the world. Christ the transformer of culture focuses on applying God's love to everything. This helps avoid a self-centered focus on what God does for me, and also avoids watering down the Bible's teachings to make culture seem better. As St. Augustine wrote in Confessions, "Let thy works praise thee, that we may love thee, and let us love thee, that thy works may praise thee." Augustine also said, "Temperance is love keeping itself entire and incorrupt for God. Fortitude is love bearing everything readily for the sake of God. Justice is love serving God only, and therefore ruling well all else as subject to man. Prudence is love making a right distinction between what helps it towards God and what might hinder it." A life of love isn't a life of unreason, Niebuhr observed. Rather, it redeems reason from idolizing itself. The promise of being able to transform culture based on a Christian worldview is an exciting one, but it seems like such a huge project. Can it actually work? And if so, how? Section 6, Transforming Culture. We're going to make it. Of all the views of culture, the Christ the transformer of culture view most neatly fits the biblical sequence of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. It enables Christians to focus on loving God with all their being, bringing the law of love to bear in every aspect of culture. This includes areas people don't ordinarily think are related to spiritual things, such as mathematics, logic, natural science, fine arts, and technology. In each of these areas, we teach the world what God has taught us, which is to trace out his designs and humbly to follow his ways. As Niebuhr phrased it, what steps might we take to participate in transforming culture in this way? I suggest 3. See culture as part of our Christian mission, take culture seriously, and create new culture. Step 1. See culture as part of our Christian mission. A common temptation among Christians is to keep faith locked securely inside church. Certainly, the opponents of Christianity would like to see it kept there, but even when there is no opposition, many Christians seem strangely reluctant to acknowledge that what Jesus says is relevant everywhere, at work, in politics, in the arts, and anywhere else. In The Last Christian on Earth, Os Guinness imagines in an allegory reminiscent of C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters a conversation between 2 demons about how to conquer civilization through secularization, that is, through stripping away the spiritual aspect of life. According to Guinness, secularization is complete not when people fail to believe in God, but when they see such belief as increasingly irrelevant. Once that happens, one demon says to another in Guinness's allegory, whatever faith is left is limited and inconsequential and lacks the mental and moral muscle to resist us. This fictional demon has uncovered a disturbing hole in Christianity's defenses. It is possible to believe every fact about Christianity, but also to be secularized to the point of acting as if those facts simply don't matter. The danger is not that brilliant arguments will dismantle Christianity, but that people will turn away with a stifled yawn. If Christ is the transformer of culture, then what he says is relevant to everything, everywhere. J. Gresham Machen, a professor at Princeton Theological Seminary and one of the founders of Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, expressed it this way: "The Christian cannot be satisfied so long as any human activity is either opposed to Christianity or out of all connection with Christianity. Christianity must pervade not merely all nations, but also all of human thought. The Christian, therefore, cannot be indifferent to any branch of earnest human endeavor. It must be all It must all be brought into some relation to the gospel. It must be studied either in order to be demonstrated as false or else in order to be made useful in advancing the kingdom of God. To hold this view, though, we must distinguish between the structure of creation, which is good, and the direction it often takes in a fallen world. Our temptation when we see the evil and corruption in the world around us is to condemn the structure of cultural ideas and artifacts rather than the uses to which they're put. Though ideas are complicated and exceptions may abound, the Christ the Transformer of culture view assumes that when the truly good happens in culture, it is because of Christ, not in spite of him. 2. Take culture seriously. Often Christians are tempted not only to accommodate a shallow culture, but to imitate it by baptizing it with sentimentalism. An entire industry has been developed to imitate popular artwork while decorating it with Bible verses, music, while scrubbing away all profanity and innuendo, and so forth. Sometimes the purpose is to create a platform for the gospel. Other times, quite honestly, it's a way of getting Christians to buy things they might not otherwise buy. The biggest problem with accommodation is that it not only leads to cheesy commercial products, but also fails to take culture seriously. It assumes that culture's value is in how quickly it can be mutated into a platform from which to preach a soundbite version of the gospel. It is revolution minus the obscenity. Unfortunately, hard experience shows that where there is no perfect song that will win the hearts of the world, and no perfectly stated meme on Facebook that will instantly silence doubters, we shouldn't be looking for an angelic appearance on national television. One example of taking culture seriously is J. Gresham Macken's student at Westminster Theological Seminary, Francis Schaeffer. In 1955, Schaeffer acquired a lodge in the Swiss Alps and named it L'Abri, French for the shelter. Along with his wife, Edith, he developed an approach to Christian engagement that didn't ignore art, music, and culture, but incorporated them into his teaching to bring out valuable truths, much as the Apostle Paul did with the Athenian leaders at Mars Hill. Andy Crouch describes Schaeffer's approach this way. He treated culture not as something to be condemned and avoided, but as a valuable dialogue partner that offered access to the reigning philosophical assumptions of the time, along with clues to the best way to convince skeptical moderns that the gospel was indeed the most compelling account of reality. As Crouch points out, God didn't isolate his chosen people Israel from other nations. Today we have a similar opportunity to take culture seriously. Let's not make the mistake of viewing our neighbors as accidents of proximity or truth as something to be compromised rather than revealed. Step 3, create new culture. Andy Crouch says the only way to change culture is to create more of it. But how do we do this? After all, as T.S. Eliot pointed out, culture is the one thing that we cannot deliberately aim at. Creating culture, or as we describe it in this book, shaping culture, is a difficult thing for Christians to do. It's often easier for Christians to focus on propositions providing that God's truth is true or that his moral standards are the right ones. But God's truth is no less true in the realms of art, music, and other expressions of beauty than it is in propositions. Law professor David Skeel, drawing on the work of Harvard professor Elaine Scarry, makes the case that beauty can create a desire for truth as much as anything else can. And this is according to Scarry, the beautiful person or thing incites in us the longing for truth. It prompts the mind to move chronologically back in the search for precedents and parallels, to move forward into new acts of creation, to move conceptually over, to bring things into relation, and does all this with a kind of urgency as though one's life depended on it. In this sense, beauty is not itself truth, but it sharpens our commitment to truth. Beauty often inspires a sense of conviction, which is, to quote Scarry again, so pleasurable a mental state that ever afterwards one is willing to labor, struggle, wrestle with the world to locate enduring sources of conviction, to locate what is true. When future generations consider whether the civilization we created was worthwhile, they will consider as much evidence from the realm of beauty as they consider from the realm of truth and goodness. Beauty is important to God. As Crouch notes in examining Genesis 2, the original Garden of Eden was a place of gold and onyx and bdellium, a tree gum that hardened into translucent white balls that were prized as jewelry as well as perfume. The description of the new heavens and new earth is similarly beautiful, with the heavenly city being described as bedecked with jewels and paved with gold. But such jewels are the product of culture, and they happen only when humans find them and shape them. Similarly, gold becomes beautiful when humans extract it from the ground, remove its impurities, and shape it. Crouch concludes, culture then is the furniture of heaven. God is an artist, so are we, and not just those of us gifted in producing paintings and sculptures and music and jewelry. Believers are daily invited to conduct masterful symphonies of grace by rescuing those wandering in misery and restoring the lost to the way of truth. Some of us do this by making paintings. Others do it through athletic pursuits, intellectual works, or practical inventions, or by starting creative new ministries or companies. It is artists who lead the way, picturing beauty and even brokenness in a way that reminds us that we are image bearers of God who are fallen, and for whom the promise of redemption means a season of refreshing and the promised restoring of all things. Believers are daily invited to conduct masterful symphonies of grace by rescuing those wandering in misery and restoring the lost to the way of truth. Christianity is culture shaping. It always has been. As sociologist Rodney Stark frames it, what caused Christianity to rise in significance since the time of Christ wasn't trickery or the abuse of power, as is often assumed, but its core doctrines which prompted and sustained attractive, liberating, and effective social relations and organizations. Conclusion. The Old Testament often uses the Hebrew word derek, which means the way, to describe a direction-filled life. For example, Deuteronomy 10:12 instructs us to walk in all God's ways, and Isaiah 40 verse 3 says to prepare the way of the Lord. The implication is that there is a right way and a wrong way to live. There is a way of wisdom and a way of foolishness. There is a way of life and a way of death. Which way should we go? If Christ is indeed a transformer of culture, then regardless of our level of skill or vocational expertise, we ought to imitate him, not it. Our surrender is to God, not to our circumstances. The hope of heaven isn't first and foremost a call to escape from the world, but a source of power by which we may do a great deal of earthly good. If we do this to God's glory, bearing his image and loving our neighbors, it's a vision that can inspire those around us as well as generations yet to be born. In spite of their disagreements, proponents of various views of culture all agree that ultimately everything comes from God. The question really is how much sin has effectively ruined God's work and what we ought to do about it now. 3/4 of a century ago, two men who are now famous, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, strolled over the grounds of Magdalen College in Oxford, England, late at night, discussing the relationship between God and humanity, truth and lies. Lewis contended that the myths he was studying as a scholar were ultimately lies and therefore worthless. No, said Tolkien, they're not lies. Tolkien went on to explain that myths are stories that ring true because they are grasping for fulfillment through Christianity. Humans may distort thoughts and thus pervert them into lies, but it is from God that all good ideas originate. As Humphrey Carpenter relates the conversation through pieced together recollections of the two men, Tolkien explained that not merely the abstract thoughts of man, but also his imaginative inventions must originate with God, and must in consequence reflect something of eternal truth. As they talked, Tolkien asked Lewis a life-changing question. Is it possible that Christianity is the great story behind all great stories? Soon after, Lewis committed his life to Christ. His resulting books inspire and give confidence to people even today. Understanding how God was at the root of culture enabled Lewis to in turn appreciate culture all the more and even shape it through his own fiction and nonfiction works. This book invites you into a journey of shaping culture. Our goal in examining the key issues of our day from a Christian perspective is not to lock down the right answers beyond a shadow of a doubt, but to find ways in which obeying God will enable us to be culture shapers who bring joy and flourishing to an often hopeless world. In the next chapter, we'll scour history for examples of how it can be done, examining the incredible lives of Christians who, operating from a biblical worldview, significantly shaped culture, especially in morality, human value, and freedom. The end.